in den frühen Morgenstunden des historischen 22. Juni. Auf einer Frontbreite von 2400 Kilometern vollzieht sich der größte Aufmarsch, den die Geschichte bisher gesehen hat.
Operation Barbarossa had actually failed even before it was launched, because with the possibilities open to Germany's political and military leaders in 1941, in the absence of a clear strategic objective, a war against the Soviet Union could never have been won.
It was the great conflict between two major ideologies of the time, fascism and communism. They clashed head-on with all the manpower and material the two sides could mobilize.
It was a war of conquest, a war of aggression in violation of international law, and a war of annihilation waged against the backdrop of National Socialist racial ideology.
People in the Soviet Union thought, the Nazi regime has begun a war of annihilation, so there is no question of me ever being ready to compromise, because that compromise will cost me my life.
Right from the start, it was an operation in which criminal behavior played a central role. The unusual, indeed specific characteristic of this operation is that law and morality were totally disregarded.
There wasn't really a plan, apart from we're going to attack the Soviet Union and take Moscow, and ideally, by then we'll have won. That was so detached from reality.
They left too hastily to change the sign. Along the cold stretches of the road back, the retreating supermen left the marks of their bestiality.
Daybreak in Moscow, June the 13th, 1942. Soviet film director Mikhail Sluky had been commissioned to document a day in the great patriotic war against Nazi Germany. A camera team took these pictures in Moscow. All signs of fear and panic have vanished, because there is no longer any danger of the Soviet capital falling to the Wehrmacht.
If we believe the generals who wrote their memoirs after the Second World War, when the Wehrmacht was stopped outside Moscow and had thus failed to achieve its first major goal, taking the Soviet capital, virtually all of them realized that the war could no longer be won. Whether it had to be lost is a matter of dispute, but it could certainly no longer be won. The generals pointed out that, in the final analysis, they were having to fight a war the political leadership had forced on them.
Adolf Hitler had decided not to launch any further assault on Moscow. By the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht's armies had been re-equipped. Reinforcements had arrived, and munitions dumps were full in readiness for a major summer offensive, which, it was hoped, would see the Red Army finally defeated.
After the failure to take Moscow, which was actually the Wehrmacht's first major defeat, the summer offensive played a major role in boosting morale in the ranks of the Wehrmacht. On the other hand, if it was accepted that, after Moscow, the war was no longer winnable, why was no alternative to a summer offensive considered? Shouldn't his military leaders have gone to Hitler and said, "We have to stop the war because we can no longer win it"? But in a dictatorship like the Third Reich, that was almost inconceivable.
Hans Bastania was a cameraman with the propaganda ministry. He had been sent to Russia to take newsreel footage with 35mm color film. His material has survived and is an authentic document of the war. Bastania was a fervent supporter of Adolf Hitler and was convinced that the war would be won.
The Germans drew on the experience which had led them to believe they would be successful. And initially they were. But they were facing an adversary who had learnt, and who by now had brought up substantial reserves. Perhaps this had not been fully realized. What is more, we once again have that incredible Russian patriotism, that capacity for suffering, that and the declaration of a great patriotic war all came into play. With an indomitable Stalin behind them, and with the will to triumph at all costs, the people were ready not just to provide the necessary forces, but also to willingly accept whatever sacrifices had to be made.
One of the Wehrmacht's objectives was Sevastopol, a strategically important city at the southern tip of the Crimea. When the Germans laid siege to Sevastopol, it had around 100,000 defenders. The Soviet leadership had ordered them to fight to the last man.
Up to the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army had tried to recover from the first month of the war by refreshing their units and obtaining new material. The plan of Germany's military leaders in the summer of 1942 consisted primarily of capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus, which were urgently needed for the war effort. By now, it was clear to everyone that this would no longer be a brief conflict. So, oil supplies would be a major requirement for being in a position to continue the war.
At the end of April, Hitler received his Italian ally Benito Mussolini to discuss plans for the offensive. The Duce too complied with Hitler's wishes.
Die Besprechungen zwischen den beiden Regierungschefs waren getragen von dem Geiste der engen Freundschaft und unlösbaren Waffenbrüderschaft der beiden Völker und ihrer Führer. Sie ergaben die völlige Übereinstimmung der Auffassungen über die durch die überwältigenden Siege der Dreierpaktmächte geschaffenen Lage und über die weitere Kriegführung der beiden Nationen auf politischem und militärischem Gebiet.
Hitler had intervened actively when his military leaders drew up the plans for the summer offensive. Amongst other things, this resulted in one offensive effectively turning into two offensives. But both had operational objectives which focused on the enemy's war economy and were designed to drastically weaken the Soviet Union. The first objective consisted of the oil fields in the Caucasus, while the second involved blocking the Volga as the Soviets' lifeline for supplies to Central Asia.
To make the operation a success for the Germans, the first necessity was control of the northern hub of the rail lines of the area and a new base of operations. That hub was a Volga River port we have come to know well, Stalingrad.
Hitler had ordered the Wehrmacht to reach Stalingrad, or at least to bombard it so heavily that it could no longer function as an important traffic and armaments hub. At this point in time, Hitler was not planning a total conquest of the city. His strategy was to surprise Stalin and once again force the Red Army on the defensive. The Nazi leadership gave its full support to the plan.
Hitler had
noticed that the Wehrmacht's offensive power was weakening. But instead of holding his troops together and concentrating them on one objective, he began to fan out his objectives more and more. He divided Army Group South into Army Groups A and B, with A heading for the Caucasus and B for Stalingrad. Another characteristic was that the gaps were having to be filled more and more with Allied troops, Hungarians, Romanians and Italians, and they constituted precisely the weak points which the Soviets would attack later.
Marshal Ion Antonescu on a visit to the front. Because of the huge losses the Wehrmacht had suffered in 1941, 500,000 Romanian troops were brought in as reinforcements. They were also involved in taking the Kerch Peninsula in the western Crimea. Operation Bastard Hunt, as it was known, was headed by Colonel General Erich von Manstein. In early July 1942, Manstein's forces finally took Sevastopol as well.
In 1942, the Germans wanted to retain the initiative. One alternative, of course, would have been a peace settlement. But Hitler didn't even consider such an option. He wanted to keep attacking and focused totally on the south. He knew that having access to oil was central to Germany continuing the war. And he also knew that without oil supplies, the Soviets could no longer wage a modern motorized war. So here too, we are talking about a decision that was not primarily military, but political.
In the Ukraine on May the 12th, 1942, the Red Army launched a major offensive on a broad front. The aim, to retake Kharkov. Sitting in a German tank, Hans Bastania filmed battle scenes.
If you want to fight a longer war, you need supplies, and above all, strategic materials like oil. The German generals wanted to continue the war, so they agreed to aim for those supplies and to block the Volga, thus harming the enemy and creating possibilities for the Wehrmacht's own operations. And who knows, perhaps the German military also thought that the Soviets might even capitulate.
Somewhere in the Ukraine, Hans Bastania filmed German troops as heroic warriors, their sights set solely on victory. Pictures like these were designed to suggest to people back home that the Wehrmacht finally had everything under control again. But precisely the opposite was true.
I find it hard to see any strategy at all in Germany's conduct of the war in Eastern Europe. I believe that basically they only ever thought one step at a time. They had the chance to seriously damage the enemy by capturing important areas, and that is what they wanted to do. But I can't see any strategic thinking behind it.
Bastania's themes were war as a source of chivalry and camaraderie. But ultimately, both were subordinated to Hitler's crazy National Socialist ideology of a master race. Many German soldiers, too, were convinced that they had a natural right to dominate the world and shape it as they saw fit. Somewhere in the Ukraine, Bastania filmed this symbolic scene of Soviet prisoners of war doing the dirty work. Right from the start, Operation Barbarossa was never a clean war. What these pictures don't show is that German brutality towards the Soviet civilian population had not abated, because the inhuman objective was still the same: to enslave the Slavic race or exterminate it.
Basically, to a certain extent, the brutalization of German troops had already been approved through the Barbarossa decree, even though certain boundaries were set, like discipline within the ranks. So at the back of their minds, the military must have thought that, in what they were doing and permitting, they were getting close to a tipping point at which soldiers would become brutalized. I would not like to speculate on whether this was actually observed.
German barbarity did not fail to have an impact.
Most of the men had gone to war, leaving behind a civilian population consisting of women, children, and the elderly. And they saw the masses of corpses left behind as the Wehrmacht advanced. Whole villages went up in flames. People were herded into churches, which were then torched. As a consequence of such crimes, the few remaining men withdrew from their villages and went into the forests. Partisan resistance is a major element in the history of White Russia, for instance.
In the Soviet documentary, A Day in the War, by Mikhail Sluky, the partisan war was glorified as a heroic defensive struggle to prevent the invaders committing further crimes. But in reality, the partisan war was a bloody conflict that claimed countless lives. The true heroes in this fight were the women.
The partisans in the forest somehow had to get hold of food supplies. This meant having contacts in the towns. Most towns were in German hands, but the Germans did not see women as a threat, especially women with children. And women who had joined the partisans used to go into town with their offspring and get hold of medicines, as well as spare parts for weapons, and indeed weapons themselves, and take them back to the camps. So the partisan war was an important conflict. It was a massive problem for the Germans because they could not get it under control.
In the meantime, the partisans had also officially become an important reinforcement in the Great Patriotic War, and after some initial hesitation, Stalin even allowed women to serve in an active role in the Red Army.
Girls who were 16, 17, or 18 years old had already grown up in the Soviet system with its ideology, its collectives, and its joint responsibility. They had been shaped by the purges of the 1930s, when the communist concept of the Soviet Union was propagated on a grand scale. So what was retrieved, if you like, was precisely what had been programmed in earlier. It was the same with Soviet men. The same pathos was addressed irrespective of gender.
Women played a different role under Soviet communism than they played in the bourgeois West. Officially, they were on an equal footing with men, but the party and the military were still male-dominated domains.
Stalin's idea, and that of the Soviet regime, was to get women into the factories so that the men could be released and sent to the front. But the women interpreted this as their own personal decision. The same patriotic sense of responsibility awoke in them as in Soviet young men, and hundreds of thousands of them flocked to the defense committees.
Soviet propaganda soon made use of the impact of scenes like this. But the Wehrmacht remained an out-and-out man's world. Close to the front or in occupied towns, women could only be deployed as nurses or secretaries. The fighting was done solely by soldiers. June 28, 1942, saw the opening phase of the Great Summer Offensive, Operation Blue.
The Wehrmacht was still an exceptionally powerful and also highly successful adversary. In preparation for Operation Blue, several encirclement battles had taken place in which the Wehrmacht, at least in early summer, had shown that it was still the master of the battlefield. And at first this southerly offensive, too, proved highly successful. However, the Red Army had learned to pull its troops back. So the big encirclement battles of the summer and autumn of 1941, when the Germans took hundreds of thousands of prisoners, no longer occurred.
Hans Bastania took these pictures in occupied Kharkov. They show a deceptive calm. Since the spring of 1942, the Ukraine's second biggest city had been fiercely contested. After the battle for Moscow, the Red Army stubbornly tried to register another major victory. Most of Kharkov's inhabitants hoped that they would at least be rid of the hated invader. But there were also many Ukrainians who cooperated with the Germans.
The Soviet population was in a bad way. In the end, it was only the will to survive that kept people going, and to some, nothing mattered anymore. They just wanted to stay alive, or perhaps protect their children by not only failing to oppose the German invaders, but perhaps by even helping them. But Stalin made no distinctions. All collaborators, he said, would be put to death.
As a deterrent, Soviet propaganda publicized scenes like this. The Red Army planned to eliminate the Wehrmacht's 6th Army in a pincer operation, but the Germans were able to turn the tide and encircle large numbers of the enemy. In a classic battle of annihilation, Hitler's tanks achieved one of their last great victories.
Kharkov was still a limited offensive, and the Germans were hugely successful. That was also in the spring of 1942, when its troops were still buoyant and the Wehrmacht showed all its ability. Stalingrad was still far off, especially the boundless expanse of the steppes which surround the city. This territory was so huge that even the Germans and their allies stood absolutely no chance of securing it. And there was not only this expanse, to the south of it lay the Caucasus.
Thanks to the speed of the German tanks and assault guns, 240,000 Soviet troops were taken prisoner. In front of the German positions, the bodies piled up. According to recent research, the Red Army's casualties, dead, missing and wounded, came to 277,000. In addition, 652 tanks and 1,646 guns were destroyed. This second battle for Kharkov was a serious blow to the morale of the Red Army. The Germans were exultant. Now, even those generals who had been skeptical marveled at Hitler's perseverance strategy. But Operation Blue was marked by German arrogance, which soon would have dire consequences.
Since June 1942, the Soviets had had a rough idea of the Wehrmacht's plans, but basic information on the Germans' next thrust literally fell into their hands when a fighterless Storch, carrying a member of the German General Staff, was shot down over Soviet-held territory. The officer had with him a briefcase containing top-secret military documents on the forthcoming offensive. The Russians reacted very flexibly to the information, retreating into the vast expanses behind them. Basically, it was exactly what Kutuzov had done with Napoleon in 1812. And they waited until the German front was so overstretched that it was relatively easy to penetrate.
For his documentary, A Day in the War, on June the 13th, 1942, director Mikhail Sluky deployed 160 cameramen at various sections of the front. Their footage was designed to demonstrate the Red Army's unbending resistance. To create the appropriate effect, some scenes were staged. War as a work of art, not as reflection of reality. At this point in time, 3 Air Force regiments, consisting solely of women, became famous.
Soviet women gained notoriety as pilots because they were so daring. German propaganda described them as the witches of the night. So as not to be discovered, they would switch off their engines and lights and fly so low that German machine gun fire would have brought them down with ease. They were so notorious because they came from nowhere.
When A Day in the War appeared in Russian cinemas at the end of 1942, one of Sluky's colleagues criticized the extremely aesthetic portrayal of an imaginary war. The Germans should not be shown as easy adversaries, he said, but as the most powerful enemies the world has ever seen. Since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans had lost 350,000 men, killed or missing in action.
From a purely professional point of view, German military leaders should have said that, in their opinion, the war no longer seemed winnable. They didn't, and so all further decisions taken in this war against the Soviet Union simply amounted to, we are going ahead with the war because we don't have an alternative. Operational solutions were sought and found and implemented, but basically, at least as far as I can see, the war was continued without any recognizable operational or strategic objective that would still have been sufficient to achieve victory or would at least have resulted in some kind of stalemate.
Case Blue had been in operation since June 28, 1942. The first objective was the city of Voronezh on the River Don. Only now that Stalin realized that the Wehrmacht was not advancing on Moscow, so he ordered Voronezh to be held at all costs. Arrival at the Führer headquarters of German armaments industrialists Hermann Röchling, Alfred Krupp and their colleagues. They had been invited by the new armaments minister Albert Speer to finally solve the Wehrmacht supply problems. Speer demanded an immediate increase in output, and the industrial leaders promised to reorganize the production of weapons and ammunition. But it was all too late.
The situation in autumn 1942 was such that anyone with any kind of military experience who looked at the map would realize at once that it was actually untenable, that it was only a matter of time before this overstretched front, which was virtually unoccupied, collapsed. Naturally, Halder also saw this, and in his diary he wrote that the situation was gradually becoming grotesque. Nowadays, it is believed that he provoked the dispute leading to his dismissal so that he would no longer have to bear responsibility for what was happening.
On July 23, 1942, the chief of the General Staff noted, "This so-called leadership is characterized by a pathological reacting to the impressions of the moment and a total lack of any understanding of the command machinery and its possibilities."
In the course of the war, the Red Army's military leaders learnt comparatively quickly how to conduct their own operations and, above all, how to counter the enemy's operations. But that took time. It really only came to bear at Stalingrad and afterwards. In late 42 and early 43, it became clear that not only were Soviet troops better equipped than they had been in the first year of the war, and that their supply system ensured they were being better and better equipped, but that in the meantime they had also gained experience in waging war. Soviet commanders had been fighting the Germans for more than a year and were coping better and better with the war.
According to Franz Halder, the tendency to underestimate the enemy's potential has always been present, but it is gradually assuming grotesque proportions and constitutes a danger. The situation is becoming increasingly intolerable. Serious work is now no longer possible. The Red Army was proving dogged and relentless. Nonetheless, time and again, Soviet troops panicked. In an order to hold out, Stalin said that anyone who retreated would be shot. The Soviet Secret Service used violence to ensure that discipline was maintained. Naturally, the propaganda machine showed heroic faces, including those of women.
In their first serious situation in action, women stood the test, and they were often more courageous than the men. In one story, a unit was under fire for several hours. One of the men lay wounded out in no man's land and couldn't be helped. It's soul-destroying having to watch someone slowly bleeding to death and being unable to do anything about it. But there was this one woman who inched her way forward on her stomach over 3 hours while constantly under fire. She brought back her comrade, who was 3 times her size, even though her commander had forbidden her to do it.
The Red Army had fewer and fewer supply problems because by now tanks were also arriving from the United States. Hitler had ignored all the warnings from his generals and had German armies advance south at high speed. At first, this strategy proved highly successful. Hans Bastania recorded events on color film.
Basically, the German approach was still the same. The Wehrmacht was even more motorized and enjoyed success. The problem was that the Soviets were now reacting a lot more flexibly. And that is actually the point at which German thrusts often came to nothing. The Wehrmacht's diminishing successes showed that its strength was basically spent. On the other hand, it speaks volumes for the discipline of its soldiers, who kept going, even though they noticed that they were enjoying less and less success.
Hitler had realized that there was an opportunity to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus. He said to his generals, "If we don't take Maikop and Grozny, I will have to end the war." Stalin knew that the Red Army didn't have enough troops in the Caucasus, so he sent the head of his secret service to put the fear of the devil in them.
Red Army leaders were under double pressure. Obviously, there was the military foe, the German aggressors and their allies, but then there was also Stalin himself. He had already taken drastic measures in response to initial defeats at the start of the war. He'd had army commanders sacked, arrested and shot. Consequently, the lives of Soviet military commanders were also always at risk from within their own ranks, so to speak. And where Stalingrad was concerned, for Stalin there was also the psychological importance of the city named after him not falling into German hands. Anyone who holds Stalingrad can blockade the Volga. The river was one of the Soviet Union's supply routes, which basically ran from a Persian corridor to Central Asia. So Stalingrad was clearly a military operational objective.
As an armaments and traffic hub, Stalingrad was only supposed to be neutralized, but Hitler then ordered the Sixth Army to take the city at all costs.
Further north, the Nazi pincers were within 15 miles of Stalingrad. This city had become the focal point of the whole campaign. Regardless of the cost, Stalingrad must be captured. Those were the German orders.
A few months previously, Friedrich Paulos had been appointed commander-in-chief of the Sixth Army. The general who had helped to plan Operation Barbarossa warned Hitler that a force of 300,000 men would not be enough to take the city.
Stalingrad was a prestige object, not only for the Soviets, but also for the Germans. At a party celebration in November 1942, Hitler had boasted Stalingrad was as good as captured. For his part, Stalin knew that if the city bearing his name fell, it would mean a massive loss of prestige. So in July 1942, the notorious Stalin order of not one step back was issued. Applying draconian measures, the Soviets then tried to stop any attempt to flee from Stalingrad, to prevent any retreat, no matter how sensible.
When the first German units reached the outskirts of Stalingrad on September the 7th, 1942, many Red Army units panicked. But Stalin's threats had the desired effect. The Soviet defenders dug foxholes and took up positions in buildings which, in good time, had been turned into fortresses.
The Germans never had control of the city. They had become involved in bitter house-to-house fighting. It was no longer clear where the front line was or where communication lines between the various positions ran. Both sides used snipers. Losses were high. Most of the city lay in ruins. The combatants fought from cellars. The military situation was confusing. There were no clear boundaries. If the Sixth Army was to be saved, it was then at the latest that German troops should have been pulled out of the city.
Wenn man Truppe hätte retten wollen, aus der Stadt heraus hätte gehen müssen.
On the other hand, there were still hopes of reinforcements arriving. But, like the replacement units that had been expected, they never appeared.
For a while, the Red Army was able to ferry men, weapons and supplies across the Volga and into the city. The Germans were unable to capture the landing stages in the town center. Then the Russian encirclement of Stalingrad was completed, and German officers told their men that the war on Eastern Front would soon be over.
Es gibt dann sehr viele Erschießungen auch.
There were many executions, some of which were carried out personally by the commander-in-chief. That really was a sign to every Soviet soldier that not a single centimetre of ground was to be yielded. On reflection, however, it paid off. It was the prerequisite for the success of Operation Uranus in November 1942, when the Red Army succeeded in encircling the Sixth Army.
When the Red Army launched a counter-offensive on November 19, 1942, Stalingrad was almost completely in the hands of the Wehrmacht. Operation Uranus was a bold maneuver. The idea was to encircle the Sixth Army within the space of a few days.
Two simultaneous attacks were launched, one from the north, one from the south. The German armies encircling Stalingrad were now themselves threatened with encirclement. Finally, the two prongs met. These battle-hardened soldiers of the Northern Army and soldiers of the Southern were emotional as children as they greeted each other. They knew this meeting meant the salvation of Stalingrad and of their country.
Hitler's risky venture had failed. More than 330,000 men were caught like rats in a trap. In the city, the house-to-house fighting continued with unremitting ferocity. Now it was the Germans who were being urged to hold out and fight to the last bullet.
Camaraderie is one of the pillars of every army, of course, along with motivation and solidarity. And in extreme situations, camaraderie is extremely important. We know from wounded soldiers who were flown out of Stalingrad that they left with mixed feelings. They felt guilty at leaving their colleagues in the lurch. So camaraderie is particularly prominent in life or death situations. When life itself is at stake, it's a massive pillar of solidarity.
Ein ganz großer Pfeiler für den Zusammenhalt.
Frontline experience is definitely something that welds people together. And when you go through an extreme situation with someone, psychologically, it has a bonding effect.
On November the 24th, 1942, Hitler decided that the troops encircled at Stalingrad would be supplied from the air. Because of the bitter cold and the shortage of food, there was a danger of the men starving or freezing to death. In view of the poor supply situation for his troops, General Paulus wanted to attempt a breakout, but Hitler wouldn't hear of it.
Where planning a war against the Soviet Union was concerned, Paulus was the classic technocrat. He implemented what he was ordered to, so he tried to devise the best possible plan that would work militarily. With regard to Stalingrad, he had a clear order, which he implemented as he had been told to. He had certain doubts as to whether everything would work out the way he imagined, but not even the Führer's orders, and in the end, not even promotion to Field Marshal, were sufficient for him to remain loyal to Hitler and hold the city, come what may.
Because the air bridge failed, the lack of food, fuel, ammunition, and heating and medical material was so serious that the Sixth Army became practically immobile. Shortly before Christmas, Paulus hoped that help would soon come from outside.
Friedrich Paulus had certain character traits which, in the crucial situation in the winter of 1942-1943, proved calamitous. He was an extremely elitist figure, but in the final analysis, he was also a weak person. Someone who was used to living in a world of staff officers, where he didn't have to confront reality so much.
Naturally,
he should have offered to surrender, not only to put an end to the fighting, but also because then the hatred potential of the Soviets would have been far less. After all, they had had to fight in the ruins for weeks on end, so their readiness to treat German prisoners badly rose from day to day.
In early January 1943, the Führer received Romanian leader Ion Antonescu at his headquarters. Hitler made the Romanians mainly responsible for the precarious situation the Sixth Army was in. Antonescu countered by criticizing the Wehrmacht and its commanders for their errors of judgment.
In 1940, Hitler was feted as the greatest commander of all time because he had taken certain decisions, or because people thought he had. Later, too, he intervened time and again in the conduct of the war, but whatever catastrophic influence he might have had can only be determined here and there. Take Stalingrad, for instance, where retreat was called for instead of what Hitler wanted. The Führer insisted, and the generals lacked the courage to say, "What you are doing is crazy. It is only costing lives."
At 7:35 on January 31st, 1943, the German radio station in Stalingrad broadcast the following message: "Capture by Russians imminent. We are preparing to destroy everything."
This was Kyle and Kessel with a vengeance. But the Nazis were getting Kesseled instead of the Russians. And on February the 2nd, 1943, after 162 days of the heaviest fighting in the history of warfare, the last shot was fired. Peace came to Stalingrad. In the shattered streets, the blasted ruins, the ghastly evidence of their ordeal, the defenders of the city greet the rescuing army of the dawn. Stalingrad is free. The Nazis had capitulated.
Friedrich Paulus surrendered. A few days previously, Hitler had promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal, expecting that he would commit suicide.
I regard Paulus as a good example of an opportunist commander who now and again follows orders he knows will not be effective instead of firmly demanding that they be changed. This proved tragic for the troops under his command, especially at Stalingrad. Even there, he was not prepared to personally accept the consequences. He expected his soldiers to fight to the bitter end while he was surrendering.
Zum Ende weiter sterben, während dann sich in Gefangenschaft begibt.
On February 3rd, Greater German Radio broadcast a special report. Under the outstanding command of Field Marshal Paulus, it said, the Sixth Army fought to the last man, finally succumbing to overwhelming odds and unfavorable conditions.
Symbolically, it was an incredibly important victory for the Red Army and a massive spur to the motivation of its soldiers. Stalingrad gave the Red Army hope, indeed the certainty, that the Germans could be beaten and driven out of the Soviet Union. For the Germans, Stalingrad was a major defeat and was perhaps seen as the psychological turning point of the war. However, the start of the Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow was actually the beginning of the end for Hitler.
A total of 91,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity at Stalingrad. Against his better judgment, Propaganda Minister Goebbels had the news spread that no one had survived.
At Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht lost an entire army for the first time. As we know, on the home front, the news came as a massive shock. In that respect, it certainly was a psychological turning point for the Germans. But, above all, it was a psychological turning point for people in the Soviet Union who saw that the Red Army, their army, could stop the enemy and inflict a decisive defeat. And, something which tends to be overlooked, On a political level, it was a warning, especially for London and Washington. They suddenly had to plan for something they hadn't expected before, that the Red Army could well be in a position to defeat the Wehrmacht on its own, and thus bring down the German Reich in Europe.
Operation Barbarossa was intended to show the world the superiority of the German master race, but Hitler and his soldiers only succeeded in underlining their desire to destroy and the criminal nature of the National Socialist regime.